Welcome to this explainer. When we take a walk through a dense forest, we usually just see wild, untamed chaos, right? Or maybe just pure natural beauty. But a mathematician walking that exact same trail, they see something entirely different. They literally see a rigid, calculable architecture. Today, we're diving straight into the absolutely fascinating, totally invisible mathematics of spatial geometry. We're going to take a conceptual walk through a virtual forest, and we'll discover the rigorous mathematical models, things like point processes and random sets, that dictate exactly how and why things grow exactly where they do.
So let's start with a simple, but honestly pretty profound question. When you look out at a forest, do the locations of all those trees represent true randomness? It's a trickier question than it sounds, for sure. To answer it, we first have to figure out what random actually means when we step completely out of traditional statistics and into physical, living space.
To really wrap our heads around this, we need to contrast how we normally think about randomness with how we absolutely must think about it in space. Usually, we think of randomness temporally, like along a one-dimensional timeline. Think of an online seller making binary decisions about whether to list an item for sale over the course of a month. Those events unfold chronologically, right? There is a very clear past, present, and future. But when we jump to a two-dimensional map, that temporal ordering just completely vanishes. In a forest, tree locations don't happen before or after one another. Instead, they exist in these super complex spatial configurations that are all about distance and density. So the math has to shift completely. Instead of tracking a chronological sequence of events, we basically have to play detective and figure out the hidden rules, the spatial point process that scattered them there in the first place.
And that brings us to the ultimate mathematical blank slate, complete spatial randomness, or CSR for short. In spatial statistics, CSR is kind of the holy grail baseline. It imagines a theoretical forest where every single tree's location is distributed uniformly and completely independently of every other tree. Actually, if you've ever thought about how cosmic photons randomly hit a camera sensor from deep space, it's the exact same mathematical principle, just applied to the dirt under our feet.
Now, for our mathematical forest to actually achieve this perfect, complete spatial randomness, it has to follow some incredibly strict rules. Specifically, the rules of a homogeneous Poisson process. First off, trees have to be totally independent. That means disjoint spatial regions have absolutely zero influence on one another. Knowing there's a massive oak tree right here tells you absolutely nothing about whether there's a pine tree 10 feet over there. On top of that, the average density, what mathematicians call lambda, has to be perfectly even, everywhere across the entire map. And finally, if you zoom all the way in to an infinitely microscopic scale, no two trees can ever share the exact same spatial coordinate.
But let's be real. Step into an actual forest, and that perfect uniformity vanishes instantly. Just look at this heat map showing the spatial intensity of maple trees in a real place, Lansing Woods. Notice those deep red pockets? That's where the maples are incredibly dense. And then you have those lighter, almost empty areas where they're super sparse. So why does this happen? Well, it's because environmental factors, things like soil quality, humidity, maybe a steep slope, they completely mess with the distribution. The rate of trees, our lambda, is no longer constant. It varies based on location. This creates what statisticians call an inhomogeneous Poisson process. The points are still independent, sure, but the underlying probability of actually finding a tree shifts dynamically as you walk across the terrain.
And hey, the environment isn't the only thing shaping our forest. The trees themselves are actively interacting with each other in what we can basically call the battle of the forest. Biology actively fights against mathematical randomness, and this cheat sheet breaks down exactly how that works. Right at the top, we have our Poisson model. That represents zero correlation, just independent scattering. But look right below that at the Cox or cluster process. Here we're seeing positive correlation. Biologically, this happens through seed dispersal. A parent tree drops seeds nearby, right? That creates a localized cluster of saplings that are mathematically attracted to one another's location. Conversely, check out the Gibbs or inhibitive process. This models negative correlation or repulsion. You can think of it like slow-motion biological warfare. Trees are literally throwing elbows underground with their roots, fighting tooth and nail for sunlight above. They actively compete for resources, which forces this kind of hardcore exclusion zone around themselves. It pushes other trees away and creates a much more regular, evenly spaced grid pattern.
Okay, confession time. Up until now, we've actually been cheating a little bit. We've been treating massive, imposing trees like tiny one-dimensional dots on a map. But in reality, trees aren't just dots, are they? They are massive physical objects with wide sweeping canopies. Back in 1933, the brilliant mathematician A.N. Kolmogorov basically challenged us to upgrade our thinking. He wrote, Let G be a measurable region of the plane whose shape depends on chance. This right here is the foundational idea behind random sets. We are officially upgrading our math from just plotting zero-dimensional points to generating fully realized two-dimensional shapes.
To actually model this in practice, we use the Boolean model, which was introduced by George Matheron. It elegantly builds our forest in 3 distinct steps. Step 1, we start with our Poisson point process. These points represent the localized tree trunks. Step 2 is where we introduce the visual intuition of mathematical morphology. Imagine taking that single trunk point and dilating it. You're expanding a boundary outward in all directions to create the wide leafy canopy, which mathematicians call the grain. Or conversely, if you are analyzing an already existing forest, you could imagine eroding a larger canopy shape to work backward and find its structural core, or trunk. Finally, step 3, we simply take the union of all these individual sets. The overlapping, merged result is our total forest coverage. Just like that, we've successfully transformed isolated data points into a continuous, textured morphological map.
But here's the catch. How do you actually mathematically measure this messy, overlapping canopy? Because standard probability kind of breaks down if you try to measure every single leaf and branch directly. Well, Matheron solved this by formalizing something called the hit or miss topology. Imagine you're flying a helicopter over the forest and you just toss a hula hoop down onto the canopy. That hoop is our test region. We simply ask, does our random forest canopy intersect our test region? If there's a leaf inside the hoop, it's a hit. If it falls straight through to empty ground, it's a miss. By doing this mathematically thousands of times across tons of different test regions, we build a capacity functional. And that's basically just a master blueprint of how chaotic and dense the forest truly is.
Now, you might be wondering, why does this matter? The absolutely crucial point here is that this isn't just abstract blackboard math. These theories, Poisson processes, Cox clusters, morphological random sets, they are actively being used out in the field to save ecosystems and protect endangered species. In fact, it turns out the exact same math used to map a static forest is exactly what we need to track one of nature's most elusive and ironically slowest creatures, the Costa Rican sloth.
To find them, ecologists used a log Gaussian Cox process. Now, I know that sounds incredibly intimidating, but stick with me. It really just means they combined the clustering math we learned about earlier with a grid of climate data, stuff like rainfall and temperature. They didn't just assume sloths were spread uniformly. Instead, they laid a computational grid over Costa Rica and incorporated random effects to account for things they couldn't directly measure. This essentially captured the hidden behavioral clustering of the animals. By mathematically calculating the empty spaces on the map, they were able to generate highly accurate predictions of exactly where these rare sloths were hiding, and that directly empowers decision-makers to target their conservation efforts precisely where they're needed most. A real game changer.
We started this explainer with a conceptual walk through the woods and discovered that the seemingly wild placement of trees and animals is actually governed by a hidden, deeply elegant geometry. We've seen exactly how spatial point processes and random closed sets decode the living world. I mean, from the competitive spacing of tree trunks to the dilated overlapping canopies above, all the way to protecting endangered sloths, it's incredible, and it leaves us with a fascinating, provocative question to chew on. If spatial math can reveal the invisible biological battle shaping a forest, what other hidden patterns in our cities, our oceans, or even our universe are just waiting to be discovered by looking at the empty spaces in between?